You have been told a story so many times that it began to feel like truth. That carbs are the villain. That white rice, bread, and potatoes are the reason your waistline has expanded over the years. That if you simply eliminate them, your body will be set free. And if you fail to lose weight, the problem must be your willpower. Let me say this clearly. It has never been that simple. The human body is not a calorie-counting calculator. It is a dynamic, intelligent biological system that responds to signals. And in this story, carbohydrates are not the singular enemy you were led to believe. If carbohydrates were truly the root cause of the obesity epidemic, then thousands of years of human history would have been wrong. Ancient Egyptians thrived on wheat and barley. Asian civilizations were built on rice. Indigenous South American communities relied on potatoes and corn as staple foods. And if you look at the blue zones, the regions where people live the longest in the world, their diets are often rich in natural starches. Yet obesity, type 2 diabetes, and metabolic syndrome were once rare in those populations. So what changed? Not the nature of rice, not the starch molecule itself. What changed was the context, the speed, the pace of life, the physiological state of the body when energy is consumed. In the modern world, we eat fast, live fast, and sit for most of the day. We pour into our bodies refined starches that have been milled, pulverized, and engineered for instant absorption, while our muscles remain largely inactive. Imagine pouring jet fuel into an engine running at full power. That energy will be converted into motion. But pour the same fuel into a machine that is idle, and it floods. The engine cannot process it in time. Your body works the same way. When glucose floods the bloodstream too quickly, the pancreas must respond urgently. Insulin is released like an emergency response team. Its role is to move sugar out of the blood and store it safely. But when insulin spikes sharply, the body temporarily stops burning fat and shifts into storage mode. The liver begins converting excess glucose into visceral fat through de novo lipogenesis. The issue is not merely how much energy you consume. It is the speed at which that energy enters your system. This completely reframes how we think about carbs. Instead of asking, should I eat carbs? The better question is, under what conditions am I eating them? Are you sedentary all day, highly stressed, sleep-deprived, and then consuming a bowl of freshly cooked, steaming rice immediately? Or do you understand your body well enough to adjust food structure and absorption physiology? Modern nutritional science has revealed something fascinating. You can change how your body processes the same potato simply by altering its temperature. You can slow starch breakdown with a tablespoon of vinegar. You can influence gastric emptying with the order in which you eat. And you can determine whether glucose flows toward muscle or liver with just a 10-minute walk. Before diving into specific protocols, you must understand the real mechanism of risk. The enemy in this story is not calories. Calories are simply a unit of energy measurement. The true threat is the glucose spike. When you eat a freshly cooked hot potato, the starch molecules have undergone gelatinization. Their structure expands, loosens, and becomes highly accessible to enzymatic attack. Alpha amylase enzymes in saliva and pancreatic secretions rapidly cleave these starch chains into millions of glucose molecules. These molecules do not enter the bloodstream gradually. They surge in like a wave. Blood sugar rises rapidly and sharply. For the body, prolonged elevated glucose is an emergency because it can damage blood vessels and nerves. Insulin is secreted forcefully to clean up the surge. And it is that intensity, not rice or potatoes themselves, that sends the signal to store fat. In everyday life, you may have experienced this without realizing it. You eat a high-starch meal, feel full quickly, yet 2 hours later, you are ravenous. You feel sleepy after lunch. You crave sweets in the afternoon. This is not a failure of discipline. It is the biological consequence of a high insulin spike followed by a rapid drop. Your body responds to speed, not morality. When we blame ourselves instead of understanding the mechanism, we surrender real control. So, is the solution to eliminate carbs entirely? No. That is a crude approach, like throwing away a car because you flooded the engine. What we need is to learn how to operate the system. Once you understand that speed is the key variable, you realize that every effective strategy revolves around slowing, regulating, and directing energy flow. We can slow starch digestion. We can create a physical barrier in the gut. We can activate insulin-independent glucose transport pathways. In that context, carbohydrates are no longer the enemy. They become a tool. When you begin to view this issue through a biological lens instead of a moral one, something powerful happens. You stop blaming yourself. You stop believing you are addicted to carbs, undisciplined, or that your body is stubborn. You recognize that your body is simply responding honestly to the environment you have placed it in. And this is where we go one layer deeper. If speed is the problem, the next question is not how many carbs should I cut, but how can I change the way carbs are processed inside my body? The answer lies not in extremes, but in technique. Modern nutritional science has shown that you can alter the metabolic destiny of the same bowl of rice simply by changing its molecular structure before you eat it. It may sound complex, but it is remarkably simple and entirely practical in your own kitchen. Let's talk about what I call the temperature lever. When you cook a potato or a pot of rice, the starch undergoes gelatinization. Amylose and amylopectin chains expand, absorb water, loosen, and become easier for enzymes to break down. That is why hot rice tastes softer and sweeter. But when you cool that starch in the refrigerator for 12 to 24 hours, a molecular restructuring occurs. Amylose chains begin to align in parallel, forming tight hydrogen bonds and creating a new crystalline structure that digestive enzymes cannot easily break apart. This portion of starch is known as resistant starch. It does not convert into glucose in the small intestine. It does not create a sharp blood sugar spike. It does not trigger a strong insulin surge. Instead, it travels to the colon, where it becomes fuel for the gut microbiota and is fermented into short-chain fatty acids such as butyrate. Butyrate nourishes the intestinal lining, reduces inflammation, and stimulates the release of GLP-1, a hormone that promotes deep, sustained satiety. What is remarkable is that this resistant starch structure remains intact even if you reheat the food. With a single preparation step, you have fundamentally changed how your body responds to carbohydrates. This is not a dietary trick. It is applied food chemistry brought into everyday life. But we do not stop there. Even if you do not have time to prepare in advance, you can still influence the speed of starch breakdown with something extremely familiar: acetic acid in vinegar. The enzyme alpha amylase, the scissors, that cuts starch into sugar, works best in a near-neutral environment. When you introduce a small amount of acid into the digestive system before a meal, the pH shifts slightly, and the enzyme's activity slows down. This means starch is broken down more gradually, glucose enters the bloodstream more slowly, and insulin does not need to respond aggressively. At the same time, acetic acid enhances glucose uptake into muscle tissue, encouraging storage as glycogen rather than triglycerides in fat cells. Just 1 tablespoon of diluted vinegar before a meal, or dipping bread into balsamic, as Europeans have done for generations, can create a meaningful metabolic difference. This is not folklore, it is physiology. However, speed is not determined only by molecular structure and enzymes. It is also shaped by the architecture of the meal itself. Most people eat carbohydrates, naked, a bowl of noodles, a slice of bread, a plate of white rice on a nearly empty stomach. In that situation, the pyloric valve between the stomach and small intestine opens more widely. Food moves quickly into the absorption zone, and blood sugar rises sharply. But when you change the order of eating, the entire digestive dynamic shifts. When you begin with fiber leafy greens, salad, legumes, you create a viscous network in the stomach and upper intestine. This mesh slows the direct contact between starch and the intestinal wall. When protein and fat follow, hormones such as CCK and GLP-1 are released, signaling the stomach to empty more slowly. By the time you eat starch at the end of the meal, your digestive system is already in a controlled state. Glucose enters the bloodstream like a steady stream rather than a flood. You still enjoy rice, potatoes, or bread, but you no longer pay for it with post-meal sleepiness or intense cravings a few hours later. This is the physics of digestion, not magic. Then comes the final step, where you truly determine the fate of glucose once it enters the bloodstream. The question is not whether glucose will appear. It will. The question is where it will go. If you remain sedentary after eating, glucose is more likely to be directed to the liver and stored as fat once glycogen stores are full. But when you move, even just 10 to 15 minutes of brisk walking, contracting muscles activate an insulin-independent glucose transport pathway. The GLUT4 transporters move to the surface of muscle cells without requiring high insulin levels. Muscle becomes a sponge, pulling glucose out of the bloodstream to use immediately as fuel. This not only lowers the glucose spike but also prevents the signaling that promotes visceral fat storage. A small post-meal habit can completely transform your metabolic response. You do not need a marathon. You simply need to respect your physiology. When you place these 4 strategies side by side, altering starch structure, slowing enzymes, building a physical barrier in the gut, and directing glucose into muscle, you begin to see something deeper. Fear of carbs was never the solution. The real issue has always been a lack of understanding about how the body handles energy speed. Carbohydrates are like fire. In the right environment, they cook food and sustain life. In the wrong environment, they burn. You do not need to extinguish fire forever. You only need to learn how to control it. And when you do, you change more than your waistline. You change your relationship with food. You shift from fear to strategy, from restriction to technique. And that is the foundation of sustainable long-term health. When you begin applying these principles in real life, the first thing that changes is not the number on the scale, it is your sense of control. You no longer look at a plate of rice as a threat. You no longer approach meals in a defensive state. Instead, you enter with understanding. That is a profound shift, because most failures in fat loss journeys do not come from eating wrong, but from believing we are fighting against our own bodies. When you understand that the body simply responds to signals of speed and context, you stop seeing yourself as a victim of carbohydrates. You begin to see yourself as the regulator. Think about a typical day in modern life. You wake up after insufficient sleep. Cortisol is already higher than optimal. You drink coffee, skip breakfast, or eat something convenient and rushed. You sit in front of a screen for hours. Stress accumulates. By lunchtime, you are hungry and eat a carb-heavy meal quickly. In that context, even a natural food can trigger an unfavorable metabolic response. Not because it is bad, but because your hormonal and nervous system environment is primed for rapid glucose shifts. Elevated cortisol raises baseline blood sugar. Inactive muscles mean glycogen stores are nearly full. When glucose enters the bloodstream, there is nowhere efficient for it to go. The liver absorbs the excess and redirects it towards storage. This is a completely rational biological cascade. Your body is not betraying you. It is protecting you from prolonged high blood sugar. That is why the strategy is not only about food, but also about rhythm. When you sleep well, insulin sensitivity improves. When you manage stress, storage signals decrease. When you maintain regular muscle activity, glucose has more safe docking stations. The 4 protocols we discussed do not exist in isolation from lifestyle. They are part of a metabolic ecosystem. When you cool starch, add vinegar, eat in sequence, and walk after meals, you send a message to your body. This energy has purpose, pace, and a destination. And the body responds by reducing storage and increasing efficiency. There is a practical insight here that many people have never been told clearly. Most visceral fat gain does not occur simply because you eat too much, but because you eat too fast while expending too little. When energy enters faster than your capacity to process it, the body must prioritize storage to avoid glucose toxicity. That means if you slow the input and increase utilization, the same amount of energy can be handled in an entirely different way. This is why two people can eat the same meal and have different metabolic responses. The one who moves regularly, sleeps well, and structures meals strategically will experience a lower insulin spike than someone sedentary and chronically stressed. The difference is not morality. It is physiology. When you begin to see carbs as a tool rather than an enemy, flexibility returns. You can plan meals strategically, you can prepare starch in advance, cool it overnight, and create resistant starch to nourish your microbiome. You can add greens at the start of a meal to build a physical barrier. You can use a little vinegar to modulate enzyme activity. You can walk after dinner instead of sitting immediately. These small actions accumulate into a significant flattening of your daily glucose curve. And when that curve flattens, your long-term hormonal environment changes with it. Another fascinating insight from metabolic science is that when glucose spikes are controlled, appetite naturally decreases. GLP-1, the satiety hormone activated by resistant starch and protein, not only acts on the stomach, but also sends signals to the brain. When that signal is strong and stable, you are no longer pulled into the loop of eat, spike, crash, crave. You do not have to grit your teeth and fight cravings. They simply appear less often. This is where many people misunderstand the process. They believe they need iron willpower to control carbs. But in reality, when you optimize physiology, willpower becomes less necessary. Your body begins working with you instead of against you. This also opens a deeper perspective on visceral fat. Visceral fat is not merely a cosmetic concern. It is a highly active metabolic tissue associated with chronic inflammation and insulin resistance. When glucose is repeatedly converted into fat through de novo lipogenesis in the liver, the process does more than expand your waistline. It places strain on the entire system. But when you flatten glucose spikes, you reduce the need for high insulin output, decrease storage signaling, and over time, the metabolic environment gradually shifts from storage toward utilization. This is a process, not an event. You cannot reverse it in a single day, but you can guide it every day. At this stage of the journey, what I want you to feel is not short-term excitement, but strategic calm. You do not need to fear rice or potatoes. You do not need to chase extreme diets that exhaust you and make relapse almost inevitable. You need to understand the rules. When you understand that speed is central, you can regulate speed. When you understand that enzymes respond to pH, you can adjust pH. When you understand that the pyloric valve responds to hormones, you can influence hormones through meal sequencing. When you understand that muscles can absorb glucose independently of insulin, you can activate your muscles. Every piece of knowledge becomes a lever. And here is the deepest connection I want you to carry forward. Health is not punishment. It is cooperation. Your body evolved over millions of years to survive in environments of scarcity and unpredictability. It reacts strongly to energy speed because, historically, that was a survival factor. In the modern world, we create artificial speed, refined starches, rapid eating, prolonged sitting, and then feel surprised when the body responds. But when you restore a more natural rhythm, when you slow down, move after meals, and eat in sequence, you return your body to a context more aligned with its evolutionary design. In that context, it functions efficiently. By the end of this journey, you may see carbohydrates differently. No longer as a black and white divide between good and bad, but as a conditional system. If you eat refined starch alone on the couch, under stress and sleep deprivation, you are sending a storage signal. If you eat whole starch that has been cooled, surrounded by fiber and protein, and then walk afterward, you are sending a utilization signal. The same food group, two different outcomes. The difference lies in how you handle it. And that is the logic of your body. Not magic, not hacks, not extreme restriction, but understanding and applying biological principles. When you stop fighting food and begin designing your meals strategically, You enter a new phase of health, the phase of agency. No more fear. No more guilt. Only knowledge, technique, and consistency. And when you sustain that long enough, the body responds with lightness, stable energy, and a healthier metabolic environment. Now, let's go one layer deeper. If you truly want sustainable change, you need to understand what happens when glucose spikes repeat over years. Each surge of insulin does more than handle a meal, it sends a storage signal. When that signal appears too frequently, cells gradually become blind to insulin. This is the beginning of insulin resistance. The body must secrete more insulin to achieve the same effect. Baseline insulin levels rise even when you are not eating. And when baseline insulin is high, the body has almost no opportunity to burn fat. This is the silent loop many people fall into. They may not overeat dramatically, but they eat in ways that keep insulin oscillating sharply. The consequences do not appear immediately, but they accumulate over time. In that environment, visceral fat is not the result of a single high-carb meal. It is the result of repeated speed. If you flatten glucose spikes daily, you reduce pressure on the pancreas, lower the demand for high insulin output, and allow the body to regain metabolic flexibility. What does metabolic flexibility mean? It means the body can smoothly switch between burning glucose and burning fat. When insulin is not constantly overstimulated, the body has time between meals to mobilize stored fat. Many extreme diets attempt to achieve this by eliminating carbohydrates entirely, but you can achieve part of that benefit simply by changing how carbohydrates are processed. Another factor rarely discussed is stress. Cortisol, the stress hormone, raises blood glucose as a survival mechanism. In chronic stress environments, baseline blood sugar remains elevated. If you add a rapidly absorbed starch meal on top of that, the glucose spike becomes even higher. This does not mean you must live in fear. It means stress management is part of metabolic strategy. Adequate sleep, gentle movement, deep breathing, time outdoors all contribute to lowering baseline glucose and improving insulin sensitivity. When the baseline is stable, carbohydrates no longer provoke such dramatic responses. Now consider the difference between ancestral carbohydrates and refined carbohydrates. Starch in potatoes, rice, and whole grains exists within its natural structure, accompanied by fiber, micronutrients, and physical complexity that takes time to break down. Refined flour and sugar, on the other hand, have had their structure stripped away, leaving almost no physical barrier. When you eat a pastry made from refined flour and sugar, you are delivering energy at near-instant speed. That is not equivalent to eating a cooled potato alongside vegetables and protein, followed by a walk. We cannot place all carbohydrates into one category and draw simplistic conclusions. Context determines response. To translate these principles into action, imagine a strategically designed day of eating. In the morning, you might choose a meal rich in protein and fiber to stabilize blood sugar. At lunch, if you eat rice or potatoes, prioritize portions that were cooked and cooled beforehand. Begin the meal with salad or greens. Follow with a protein source, such as fish or meat, and finish with starch. Before eating, you might dilute a tablespoon of vinegar in water. Afterward, take a 15-minute walk. In the evening, repeat the same structure. This is not a harsh diet. It is structure. And structure creates stability. When you apply this consistently for several weeks, you may notice subtle but meaningful changes. Post-meal sleepiness decreases. Hunger between meals becomes less intense. Late-day sugar cravings lose their grip. Energy feels steadier. And when energy is stable, you naturally move more. Increased movement improves insulin sensitivity. A positive loop replaces the negative one. It is important to understand that this is not an instant fix. Your body needs time to recalibrate its signaling. If you have lived with insulin resistance for years, the process may be gradual. But each properly structured meal is a vote for a healthier metabolic environment. You do not need perfection. You need consistency. And before we close this journey, here is the final point I want to emphasize. You are not meant to battle food. You do not need to eliminate an entire nutrient group to feel in control. You need to understand biological laws and apply them intelligently. Carbohydrates are not inherently enemies. They are a powerful energy source. When handled in the right context, they nourish the microbiome, support muscular function, and fuel the brain. When consumed at the wrong speed and in the wrong environment, they create metabolic pressure. The difference lies in strategy. Remember the engine analogy we discussed. Fuel is not bad. The problem arises when you pour it too quickly into a system that is not running. If you regulate speed, adjust the environment, and use energy at the right time, the engine runs smoothly. Your body works the same way. When you respect your physiology, when you slow down, move, and structure your meals, the body responds with efficiency. Visceral fat is no longer prioritized for storage. Insulin no longer operates in emergency mode. Blood sugar no longer swings wildly. Designing your diet is not a journey of suffering. It is a journey of understanding. You do not need to fear rice, potatoes, or bread. You need to understand how they interact with your body in specific contexts. When you do, you change more than your physique. You change your relationship with food. And when that relationship is grounded in science rather than fear, you build a sustainable foundation for long-term health. That is not a miracle promise. It is biological logic.